Hello, welcome everybody.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think
I'm Todd Wagner with the Department of Undergraduate Research. I want to welcome all of you to today's CUR Conversation, Failure is Not a Word to Fear, featuring the editors of Confronting Failure, Approaches to Building Confidence and Resilience in Undergraduate Researchers. This CUR Conversation is being recorded, and all registrants will be emailed in the coming days a link to the audio or to the video and audio once it's been processed and uploaded to our YouTube page. And we ask that unless you're sharing your thoughts or questions, you just kind of remain muted. And if you need any technical assistance, Luke Z, if you'll just hit him up in the chat, he will be more than happy to help you with any technical needs you might have. I want to also make you aware before we introduce our speakers for today that this is the first of 4 CUR conversations we have planned and inspired by the book Confronting Failure. The remaining 3 will focus on will feature various chapter contributors to this outstanding book. Preparing for Failure is on September 29th and will deal with the ways we can proactively shape structural support when confronting failure. Responding to Failure is on October 6th and centers on the ways that we can respond to failure while keeping the undergraduate researcher in mind. And then finally, Mentoring Through Failure is on November 1st and looks at the role of the leadership community when it comes to confronting failure. Information and registration links can be found at the upcoming events page on the CUR website, and that's at cur.org. In just a second, we'll introduce our 3 speakers, but before I do, I wanted to remind you that Confronting Failure is an open access book, and this means anyone, CUR member or not, can get a copy of the book for free, and it's located at cur.org/bookstore. And now we'll spend a few minutes introducing the editors and let them kind of talk briefly about the concepts and guiding themes of the book. And then we will move right into engaging with you, your thoughts and your questions. I will be monitoring the chat. So if you're more comfortable leaving a question in the chat, you can do that and I will bring the question forward. Otherwise, if you can just raise your hand, or if no one else is speaking, just unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. So we'll start off with Lisa. Lisa's name appears first on the book. So Lisa, can you just give us a brief introduction to you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Corwin. I am a discipline-based education research faculty at CU Boulder in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So that means I do education research mainly in the field of biology on how biologists learn and how they develop as scientists. And one of my primary research interests is how students cope with failure and how that can contribute to their learning. And so my lab and the folks in my lab are very interested in that. And I have been here for about 6 years and met Jen and Lou about, 5 or maybe 5.5 years ago. So I'm very excited to talk about our work together today.
And then Lou.
Hi, everybody. I'm Louise Charkoudian. I'm at Haverford College, a small liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia. And I'm an associate professor in the chemistry department. And failure has been really important in my time as a faculty member at Haverford, both because once upon a time I was a student at Haverford who failed their first organic chemistry exam, and now I teach organic chemistry. And so I try to help, students navigate some unexpected bumps along the way in that lecture class, as well as I teach a lot of course-based undergraduate research experiences where there are plenty of failed experiences and ambiguous data and unexpected results. And so I've been really interested in this for a while and grateful to work with Jen and Lisa on this.
And then Jen.
I'm Jen Heemstra, and I'm on the faculty at Washington University in St. Louis, where my lab focuses on supramolecular chemistry and chemical biology. So we're basically building with Lego bricks, but where those Lego bricks are molecules, and we think that biomolecules are basically the coolest Lego bricks ever. And so we are designing and building and testing systems, and failure is just an inherent part of that. And so I frequently tell my students that I am a professional failure, like fail ER, in that, if you start thinking about how many years you worked in a lab and how many failures you had every day in lab, all of a sudden it totals up to like, I have had, tens of thousands of failures in my career. But I got interested in this topic largely just through leading a lab and recognizing that how we think about failure, how we approach our experiments when failure is possible is having a really big impact on our success. And then realizing just how important that is for researchers, but that, we could gain a lot if we're also intentionally teaching that to students in the classroom.
Right. And then before you mute yourself again, Jen, I know this book is part of a larger effort, part of the FLAME network as well. That's factors affecting learning attitudes and mindsets in education. So Jen, can you tell us a little bit about FlameNet?
Oh, I would love to. Thank you. And then I'll let Lou and Lisa chime in as well. So FlameNet is really how we built this collaboration that ended up being able to provide the context for editing this book and bringing this to the community. And so this started, I guess, about 5 years ago when Lisa and I met at a workshop and started talking. And I was interested in thinking about how we can help students learn about failure and learn how to fail. And then Lisa said, oh, that's what my research is on. I was like, oh my goodness. So I know how to fail and you know how to study failure. So this is wonderful. And at the same time, Lou had invited me to be a co-author on an article about course-based undergraduate research experiences, and failure was part of that. And so between the three of us, the idea really cemented to bring this into the community, realizing that there was a lot being done around mindset and these interpersonal factors, especially in K-12 education. And there were some efforts, some really great efforts in higher education, but far less. And so we said, well, let's get together and try to do something about this. Let's build a community and support each other in creating culture change in academia to create spaces that help students grow and become resilient. And the thing that we've really loved about this network is that we have a very interdisciplinary group of people. And so, I realize like I'm the boots on the ground instructor in the classroom who's, doesn't know how to put together an intervention or how to study it. But I understand what's going to work in my teaching. And then we have people, education researchers who can help us understand what makes for good classroom practices and how to study that. And we have psychologists who can help us to understand really the conceptual foundations of the things that we're applying. And we basically are in the business of bringing a really fantastic group of people together and creating relationships and empowering people to go and do great things that benefit students.
And so for the three of you, any of you, building off of that, I'm struck by just how inclusive the chapter contributors are, both in like staff position. You have administrators, you have faculty mentors, you have just across the board, all sorts of positions. And then you have people that are in community colleges and those in four-year institutes. I think you even had someone who is in a lab full-time. Like, you really thought this through on just being inclusive, as well, of course, being very discipline focused. I mean, you have STEM authors, you have arts and humanities. Was that, I assume that was very intentional. And is that simply because failure is a universal topic, or was there more behind that?
I'll chime in here. So yes, it was very intentional. And as we've explored this topic more and more, and typically, we've explored this within STEM, all being people who are from STEM backgrounds, but we've just found it really fascinating, the roles that failure plays across disciplines. And one of the coolest things that has come of this is that we've really discovered that failure can be an epistemic experience. And I just want to give a shout out to Sandhya Krishnan, who's in the audience, who's really helped articulate these ideas for us. And it can be this kind of learning experience, but in different ways across disciplines. So it's really cool how there's different kinds of failures across disciplines, and that those things help students actually learn the practices of the discipline and how to build knowledge within that discipline. So we really wanted to explore that and from a diversity of different perspectives and different institutional perspectives, which are very important to us. And so we tried to capture that. And through that process, I'll just say that I learned so much more about failure and how it shapes people's learning and how it shapes people's experience. And one of the most fascinating things to me was learning how it does this in drama and through comedy, and also in the literary sciences. So I thought that was really fun.
Yeah, I would just add that it really opened my eyes, I think, to the definition of both undergraduate research as well as failure. I had, I think, a more narrow vision of what that looked like because of my role as a STEM instructor. And helping be a part of putting this book together really made me realize there's a lot of different ways undergraduates can engage in research, and many different types of failure experiences. And when we think about supporting a student who's not just taking one class, but many classes across an institution, thinking about all these sorts of these different structures to support students navigating failures can be really powerful.
The introduction ends by saying, we urge readers to consider how this work can be used as a starting point from which to drive forward movements that seek to better understand and design practices that support students when confronting failure. And so we simply want to spend the rest of the time engaging with your either stories of failure or lessons you've learned through failure, or also questions you may have from the book. So the floor, audience members, is yours. Once again, you can enter your question into the chat. You can raise your hand, which is under the reactions, or if no one else is speaking, simply unmute yourself and ask your question. Since we have a very shy audience right at the moment, I will ask a question. So my background is not in undergraduate research, though I did spend over a decade working with high school students. So a lot of this made a lot of sense to me. As we kind of mentioned before, I was amazed in your introduction, you talk about how failure, you use words like necessary, valued. At one point, you quote an article that talks about how formative it is and how it even makes it more authentic. Is there anything as the chapters kind of came in that struck you as just how universal, but also how powerful failure can be? I guess I should say how powerful our response to failure can be.
Sure. I'll chime in again. So I think that one of the things that struck me, and I'll just invite the contributors that are here in the audience to chime in as well, because I know I saw some of their names out there. But in the literary sciences, and when performing literature searches, right, to do research and find research on different topics, it really struck me how failure is very similar to what we experience in STEM, in that way that it can happen frequently and quickly, and then you can learn something from each small failure. So it was very much that same iterative process of taking a disciplinary practice, in this case performing that search, and then learning from what didn't go right. Like, you get certain results from that and they aren't quite what you're looking for, but you can take those results and say, oh, I see that if I had said this, maybe something different would have come up. And then you can apply that to your next iteration. And especially in some of the fields of biology where we iterate a lot, like in molecular and cellular biology, where there's a chance to redo an experiment again and again. You might tweak your PCR, tweak your primers, change change what you're doing just slightly, those things are so similar. And so it makes me really think that, we can learn from each other in terms of how we teach our students about how to capitalize on the knowledge we gain from each failure, and then we can apply that across multiple disciplines. And it was fun to see how people did that within these different disciplines. So that really stood out to me.
I guess I'll chime in as well and say that something I really came to appreciate through reading the chapters that came in is the importance of the context of the failure, that failure doesn't necessarily promote resilience or perseverance or growth or learning or science identity or any of those things in students. And again, I will say that Sandhya Krishnan's work on this has been also really informative to me as we've gotten to work with her through FlameNet. But it's the context of that failure. It's the environment, and whether there's a mentor or teacher or other leader who is there to say, yes, this was supposed to happen, or this makes you a scientist, and validates that failure is part of science versus failure is something that indicates that maybe you shouldn't be in science. And that for each of us, something that I know I'm continually growing in myself is just the words I use and the attitudes that I bring into conversations with a student who is experiencing failure, and that all of the things that we bring in about our own views of failure get reflected in the way that we teach and mentor, and that can have a really profound impact on whether a failure becomes a growth experience for students, whether it makes them feel like more of a scientist or whether it makes them feel like they don't belong in science. And I just loved how so many of the chapters really dug into that theme and offered really practical, mindful ways that we can have those conversations with undergraduate researchers in a way that is promoting resilience and helping them to feel more included in science through their failures.
There's a couple questions in the chat. Eric Hall is wondering, do you think that the topic of this book is more timely now than, say, 5 years ago?
I feel like you could really go either way on this one. So yes and no. I think that what we're seeing across the board in society is that things are accelerating. And I guess what I mean by that is we have so much more access to technology and information and the ability to gather information. And that creates a world, in my opinion, and in some other folks' opinions as well, that it is so much quicker to do research and to iterate. Not all forms of research, of course, but the technology has really enabled that for us. And at the same time, right, things are just getting more complex because we're so interconnected, because there's acceleration in things like climate change, which I'm really concerned about, and other things like that. Our problems are becoming more complex. So I think that people who are engaged in research across the board are going to be encountering more failures in the future and more quickly. So being able to fail fast and recover might become a more essential skill. But having said that, I think failure has always been a part of research. It's always been a part of science. And so I think that it would be just as timely 10 or 20 years ago to talk about these things. It just might be that our students are encountering more of these now. So I think for that reason that it's extremely important to also tackle sort of the emotional reactions that we have to failure, because those are important and related to the next question. But I'll pause there so we can fully address that first question.
I also think about, like, over the past 5 years, I'd be curious, Lisa and Jen, what you think about this, but, of course, there was the onset of a global pandemic, and that hurtled all of us into this, 2-3 year web of challenge and uncertainty, which is sort of like one big, shared failure event that our undergraduates experienced and responded to. And so it does create an interesting opportunity to talk about, uncertainty, ambiguity, your college experience not being what you had maybe hoped or planned, and how to productively navigate that space and pivot as well. And so in some ways, I feel like it's very timely to think about these things, because our undergraduate students they've all experienced some level of failure with the pandemic.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly that, and Lou said it so much better than I ever could have. So I will just let her words stand.
And then the next question is, can you share your thoughts on how, as editors of the book, can you share your thoughts on how students experience failure in the disciplinary space and the relationship to their identities?
Boy, there's so much to talk about here. I want to highlight the first chapter in the book by Nikisha Williams, just as a resource for people who are thinking about this. And also say that I believe Dr. Krishnan might explore these ideas in some of her work, but prior work on failure indicates that there's definitely an interaction with student identity. And a lot of the things I want to clarify first, that a lot of the things we talk about when we talk about failure, some people might not use the word failure for those things. They might use the word setback or mistake or error. And so what we're talking about is some small F failures in addition to big F failures. The small F failures are like, oh, my PCR didn't work, I got to go back and do it again. Oh, that literature search didn't work, but there's some research to suggest that students of certain identities might see those sort of small F failures as really impactful things that indicate that they shouldn't be in the discipline. And this is especially impactful for students who experience stereotype threats in the environments that they're in, and also for students who might struggle with depression or anxiety, things like that. So certain groups of students are experiencing these failures differently, and they have potential for very negative impacts, which is why, to Jen's point earlier, we need to be so careful and cognizant about how we navigate these things as instructors in the classroom.
Our question is about location. In that, do you think there's a difference in the way that a community college student receives and responds to failure as a learning experience compared to one at a four-year college?
Okay, I'm jumping in here again, but I'm talking a lot, so you should all, feel free, anyone to jump in, even folks from the audience. So Heather is at a community college. I'd be super curious to hear what Heather thinks about this. I am so hesitant to make any generalizations about CC students because they span the gamut from any kind of background you can imagine. I'm sure that a CC student has had it. And so I think that I taught at a community college for a while, and one of the things that I was really struck by was that community college students were extremely resilient because they often have stories, and I'm making a generalization here that I maybe shouldn't, but they often have stories that have required them to develop resilience through life experiences. And they're more likely to have had those experiences than students at least my institution, CU Boulder, which is a four-year college with mostly traditionally aged students. So I would say that there are differences there, and the differences are really dependent on each individual student, but that overall, I think those students have had opportunities to encounter challenge and develop resilience that maybe other students have not.
I think that was fantastic. And I will just add into that saying that a very fair criticism, I think, of the whole dialogue and our part in that around failure and promoting kind of resilience to failure is that because of systemic injustice, there is a very real sense in which it takes privilege to be able to endure failure. And that privilege comes in all sorts of forms of socioeconomic privilege, of demographic privilege, of the privilege of having supportive mentors or supportive family. And that's something that I think as anyone in higher education, anyone interacting with students, it's something that we need to be really mindful of in the way that we talk to students about failure. Because for one student, the ability to fail and recover might be like, oh, no big deal, I'll learn. Whereas for another student, it could have some very real consequences for them. Something that I think, a finer point has come to in a lot of the dialogue around mindset and fear of failure over the last, several years is this idea that when we talk about, sort of embracing failure, it doesn't necessarily like run out and go fail because failing is good. Every once in a while, failure does lead us to something positive, and it's great to tell those stories to students, but it's not about trying to fail. Often failure is very, very bad, and that you do need to have success often in order to get the degree or get the position or whatever that might be. And that's just a very real thing, that failure has a cost for us. But rather the message in this is that if we are afraid of failure, then that actually leads us into a set of behaviors that makes us more likely to fail. And that if we can help students to develop a comfort with the possibility of failure or with the failure that has happened, it will lead them into a set of behaviors that will actually make them more likely to succeed. And so that could look like an undergraduate working in the lab who has their experiment fail. If they think that failure is a judgment on them, then they're more likely to kind of just go back and, maybe try and, not talk about what happened or try and fix it themselves. Whereas if we talk openly about failure and it's a necessary part of science, then if that helps them feel more comfortable going to their mentor and saying, hey, I did this experiment, it didn't work, I know this is part of science, can we talk about where we go from here? It isn't that failure itself was a good thing, but it's that having that openness to it helps create an environment where they can have the ability to be more likely to be successful in the end. And then that's really the goal.
Once again, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions or put them in the chat as we wait for more questions to come in. I'm wondering, the language of confidence and resilience, was that intentional? Why not confronting failure, building humility and empathy in undergraduate research? How did we land on those two adjectives in the subtitle?
I'm going to be real honest and say that those were suggested to us by the CUR staff, and they resonated with us, and so we went with them. But I think that we could have easily gone with additional adjectives. In fact, I think that the ones that you suggested, which I'll have you repeat, humility and empathy, those are just as important. And a lot of times I think, I want to return to Jen's point around the empathy piece. So a lot of what Jen is talking about, there's some great literature on coping self-efficacy, and it's one's confidence in one's own ability to cope with things that are stressful or like failures. And we can be really empathetic around that as instructors, as scientists, as people who've done research and professionals who failed. And I think that being empathetic to those feelings around how it is to fail and that it's a challenge can really help students actually build the coping self-efficacy that they need. Because coping self-efficacy isn't just about figuring out what went wrong from sort of an instrumental standpoint. It's also about being able to cope with the emotions and move through those. And so that can become part of what we do as well.
Can I just respond to that real quick? Thank you for sharing the rationale behind thinking of like humility and empathy. When you brought it up, Todd, I was actually thinking like, no, I don't think that would be. I'm sort of pushing back on that. I don't know if that's what I want students to develop. I think I want students to develop confidence, but the humility and empathy, I think that's more important for, honestly, instructors and researchers to then think about how they're engaging with students who experience failure. So I think it's important for instructors to experience failure, or not, and it maybe even in teaching, and then realize, how much their students struggle. So in that sense, yeah, for students, I think the confidence and resilience are the adjectives that I would use. But on the teaching side of it, I think humility and empathy is absolutely what I would emphasize. I would love to hear if anybody else has other thoughts in the audience too.
I have to quickly highlight Heather Townsend's work that speaks to that specifically in our volume. And so if people are interested in that, I feel like there was another chapter that's not on the tip of my tongue that also speaks to that. Perhaps Lisa Jasinski's chapter, but it's not on the tip of my tongue.
I'll throw out one more adjective that I really pulled from a lot of the chapters, which is authenticity. That in addition to the humility and empathy, that authenticity really goes with it, of being, often we're so afraid to admit our own failures. We're afraid we might lose respect, or that somehow there needs to be that kind of professional wall there. But really, in an obviously appropriate way, and we should share because we want to share and not feel compelled to. But when appropriate, sharing about our own failures can be a very powerful thing. Exactly where Lou led in her introduction is that for students, they are looking at people who are further along in the career path, wherever that is. I remember being an undergraduate and looking at the graduate students and just saying, like, I could never do what you do, right? You know everything, right? You know everything, and everything always goes right for you, and things aren't going right for me. And so I could never do what you're doing. And, I always appreciate that they're like, no. Let me tell you how it is, right? We fail all the time, you'll get there. And I think that especially the further we move along in our careers and the more privilege we have in the academic system, then the more we can be kind of setting aside that privilege, or even leveraging it through authenticity in order to help students feel less alone in the things that they're going through, or to normalize the things that happen for them. In my lab, I have a famous story I tell about, like, how I used pipetters and I didn't read the instructions, and I was grossly misusing them. And then my data looked funny, and my PI came along and saw the data and was like, well, that's weird. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to repeat it. And I went and read the instructions, was like, oh, I was doing that wrong. And the data looked much better. And he said, oh, what changed? I was like, oh, I just figured out an error that I made, and I didn't want to admit at the time. But, for students in our labs, when they make a mistake that where they think, I shouldn't have made that mistake, they're already beating themselves up. And the more we can come along and just say, like, oh yeah, I'm right there with you. That's happened to me too all the time. I feel you. There's no shame in that. Learn from it and let's all move on.
Yeah, I've certainly observed, Jen, when I do share with my students my own struggles with organic chemistry, and how, I was one of those students that can memorize their way through Gen Chem, but then as soon as I hit Orgo, it wasn't working anymore, and I failed my first exam, and I had to, sort of change the way that I was engaging in the material and my study habits in general. I've noticed that the students become more help seeking, right? They come and ask me, can you tell me about how you changed, your study, your approaches to studying, what are things that maybe I could try out? And that, I've learned is an adaptive coping mechanism for, dealing with failure. And so I've sort of witnessed a little bit of this, I think, in the context of the classes that I teach.
Just a note, Lisa, who is the contributor for chapter 11, says the empathetic mentors and professors does come up in her chapter. So if you're interested in that, chapter 11 would be another chapter to check out. Anastasia has a question. Are there any recommendations to help mentors in approaching this topic to develop a culture of learning from failure? Example, discuss upfront, tell personal anecdotes and stories, as well as how to react when they happen.
So I'm just typing in the chat, finish. Okay. So the Hager and Ullman chapter discusses a little bit, not now, how anecdotes can help normalize failure. And there's also a chapter on mentoring by Dunbar, Wallace, and Henry that can be looked at for those. So I think that those are great things. And then I'll just add that there's some work on mentoring specifically from the University of Georgia, from the Aaron Dolan's lab, that would be very helpful to look at. They discuss negative mentoring, and actually failure comes up in that work in terms of avoiding some behaviors that are ultimately more damaging when a student fails. So that could be really useful and helpful. But those are all resources. And then in terms of, setting up, I'll just talk more anecdotally now. I got an opportunity to visit some folks who really think about failure in their lab at University of Georgia. And one of the things that one of these people has found very effective is being extremely transparent about expecting students to fail and expecting them to come and speak with him about their failures and expecting to troubleshoot with them. And he actually is like setting up this thing like, I want you to fail at least 5 times the first week that you're here. Like, he has this expectation that people do this and then come talk with him. So that's very transparent. And he also talks a lot about his own failures. So I think that and his students also told me that was really resonated with them, that really helped them to be more comfortable with talking with him. And I think that that's a great thing. So having that sort of growth-minded approach to mentoring is great. There's also some work to suggest that instructors with growth mindsets have better outcomes for their students. And I think this kind of goes along hand in hand with mentoring is if we believe that ourselves and our students can improve with time and can iterate to learn, then they also believe that of themselves.
In the chat, if you don't have your chat window open, in the chat, there are several people also chiming in on ways that they use that. And I would just want to point out, of course, we have upcoming CUR Conversations specifically on preparing for failure, which might deal with preparing lessons plans and curriculum and being ready to expect failure like that. And then we also have one specifically on mentoring. I saw someone's hand raised. I'm sorry, I wasn't fast enough. If you will raise your hand again. In the meantime, Caroline has a question in the chat. How does this being open about your failures impact faculty of different ages, stages, and identities? How do we help mentor or develop faculty knowing there are real inequities here in academia?
I think that's a great question, and I'm hoping my colleagues who are further along in their careers and who are actually doing a lot of work with faculty right now will chime in on this. But I'll say that this is an open question. I haven't seen this in the discipline-based education research literature, and it could be that I'm not looking broadly enough, but it is a question, and people are sort of considering this type of question within our field. But in parallel things in terms of like, how does it impact instructors of different identities to come out as LGBTQ+ in the classroom? So these kinds of questions are being considered, but we do need to consider that different identities will impact how students perceive and respond to our stories of failure. So I'm hoping that Jen and Lou, who are working directly with their faculty at their institutions, will talk about their experience with this.
Yeah, this is such a fantastic question. So thank you so much, Caroline, for asking this. It's a fantastic question, and you know, I'll just offer my own thoughts, but I think this is something that we really need to continue having dialogue about in our community and thinking about, because it's you know, really until we correct, until we achieve full just communities, until we counteract all of the systemic biases and inequities in academia, in society, this is going to continue to present a real challenge. And it's, you know, it really falls at the intersection of different forms of privilege. That as faculty, we may have, you know, we have some privilege relative to our students. And so, you know, I'll bounce off my last answer that when I talked about authenticity, you know, I said, okay, so, you know, we can kind of use that privilege in order to share and be authentic. But at the same time, I so appreciate this question, because it recognizes that, you know, different faculty, because of their identities have, or their career stage or whatever that might be, have different amounts of privilege. And, you know, it takes a lot of privilege in order to be able to be authentic. And so for, you know, for faculty who are maybe very early in their career, or especially are from identities that are underrepresented in their field, and especially when you get at the intersection of multiple of those factors, you know, if someone is experiencing more often having their credentials questioned, or having their knowledge or expertise questioned, if that's already a daily experience for them, then being authentic about their failures may not be a safe thing to do. And that we need to be just incredibly sensitive to each individual's different, you know, place that they're at, or if someone is coping with a really challenging life situation or a mental health struggle, they might not be in a place where sharing and being vulnerable and being authentic is healthy. And it's something, it's a really, really important, I don't want to say nuance, because that undervalues it. It's a really important consideration as we talk about how faculty interact with students. And, you know, something that I think about a lot in considering this, like, you know, when should we share? When should we be authentic? When should we talk about our failures? It, you know, goes to some of the research that Brene Brown has done on vulnerability, and what she writes about there, of just that it should be something that we do from a place of health and wanting to share, and not something that, you know, we should never be compelled to have to be vulnerable, because really that's what sharing our failures is inherently being vulnerable, because you don't know how people will react. And it may be that then they will in fact say, oh, well, my professor said they failed, and so I don't think that they should be my professor. I don't respect them. And the ability to be respected when sharing your failures is very, very closely tied to privilege, which is then closely tied to identity. So thank you for raising that question. I don't, as you can tell from my answer, I don't have any good answers, but it's something that I think is an incredibly important conversation for our community to keep having.
Yeah, I agree. I would just add that I know Kirsten Perez has been currently at Columbia, previously at MIT, and before that Haverford, has been looking into this a little bit in terms of belonging, and, you know, shares sort of strategies that have worked for her in terms of starting off, you know, the semester with talking about her credentials, why she's qualified to teach this class, and sort of leading with that. And then later on, you know, bringing in a little bit more vulnerability, but kind of frequently drawing back to it. Okay, I missed class, you know, I'm going to miss class on Wednesday because I am, and then this amazing thing that she's doing, right? And so she sort of will come back to her credentials a lot, but also be open about her vulnerabilities. And that's one strategy that, you know, she speaks to. And I think it's important for us, you know, to think about how being vulnerable will look for different faculty at different career stages and different identities.
If you wanted to jump in, oh, I see. She posted in the community chat. While I catch back up on the chat questions, I'm wondering, I know the three of you were also part of an article on failure that came out 2018, 2019, sometime in that time range. Was there anything you've learned in turning maybe turning is not even the right word, but turning it into a book? Like, is this your first time editing a book? What was that experience like? Was it easier, harder? Were there moments of failure even in the formation of the book that you can speak about?
Oh gosh. This was really challenging and it was so much fun. And this is the first time that I've ever endeavored to do anything like this. I know Jen has done things like this in the past, and this is why it was so essential to have a team for me personally. One of the things that was really challenging to grapple with was editing work from across so many different fields. And so we had to really consider that, and in some cases bring in additional expertise to help us think about some of the chapters, and also be very flexible. I mean, in STEM, I feel like a lot of the time we're relatively rigid. And so we really had to think more flexibly about the definitions of failure, the definitions of research, and be open to all different kinds of research traditions across disciplines. And so that was daunting. And I feel like, my first read of things definitely was a fail at times. And I had to go back and reread things again and rethink about how to respond and how to support people. And it really helped as an editor. I was just starting also as a monitoring editor at Life Sciences Education, and I think that this experience has enabled me to hopefully give better feedback, and I'll leave that up to the authors. But that's been my experience. So yes, there were failures and many successes, as you can see from the fabulous chapters that we have in the book.
This was definitely a first for me too, and I'll just share that I was really nervous about it, and I was so worried about, I guess, failing, that almost didn't accept the opportunity. And Lisa and Jen were sort of there to be supportive along the way. And so in some ways, I felt like I had to brush aside some fear of failure in order to to edit the book, which was really nice.
I'll say too, I've done maybe one thing similar to this in the past, but it was around course-based undergraduate research experiences. And due to probably mainly a failure of my own time management skills, I had just said, okay, we need to get, here's a template, and everyone fill out the template about your CUR, and we're going to bring together this resource, and got it edited with a great group of people and published. And this was a completely different experience because we wanted it to be more open-ended. I will say Lisa and Lou were the primary drivers of bringing the volume together, but I certainly learned a lot and experienced some failure and grew in thinking about how to create a volume that is so inclusive of different disciplines and different perspectives, but while keeping it grounded in best practices and the literature. That was, I think, a constant balance that we were navigating, is to think about the goals and to include as many different interpretations of the vision for the volume as possible, but while still keeping it a cohesive volume.
I will throw this into the chat as well, but I'm wondering about the 6 pressing questions that you guys pose in the introduction. You write, the following 6 pressing questions face undergraduate educators, administrators, and educational researchers. The first is, what type of research failures exist? The second, how do undergraduates respond when they encounter research failures? Number 3, how can we support adaptive responses to failures? Number 4, how do we prepare students for failure and help them develop resilience prior to when failures occur? Number 5, what structures and supports need to be in place at institutions, programmatic, and course-based levels? And number 6, how do we build instruction on coping with failures and developing resilience more explicitly into the curriculum? And I'm just wondering, I guess, are those just 6 questions that instantly you guys knew needed to be addressed within the book? Are those things that came as the chapters came in? Are those just something dear to your heart? Did that come from the article you guys had previously written? Like, tell me more about these 6 questions. And I know we have proposed these to the contributors, so they will be dealing with those 6 questions in the upcoming CUR Conversations as well. But as editors, tell me a little bit more about these 6 questions.
So I feel like, excuse me, I feel like these both came out of working with all of the fabulous authors and grappling with some of the questions within their work as we were editing, and also from grappling with this over several years together as collaborators. And one of the things that I think has been really fascinating for us for a long time is just what people see as a failure, because it varies drastically within disciplines. And I'm gonna again highlight Sandhya Krishna's work here because her dissertation explores this question. But they really vary drastically within disciplines and across disciplines. And understanding the type of research failures is really necessary to answer all of the rest of these questions. Because without knowing that first question, we can't even begin to conceptualize like what the rest of the stuff is going on. So the things that we were talking about when we came up with the rest of these questions after that first one were really, okay, we need to think about different levels of how and when we deal with failure. And first, we also need to just understand like what's currently happening. What is the current landscape of undergraduates' response to failures? Maybe it's already fantastic in a lot of ways, and we can learn from those ways and then promote those when it's not. And really then building both support at the instructional level and sort of the system level, and then at the curricular level, like thinking about the different components that can support students toward resilience was something we were considering when asking these.
I'll say too that a lot of this reflects kind of going down these questions reflects a lot of the evolution of the collaboration that we've had with FlameNet. And I should have said at the start too, that one of the reasons why we mentioned that is that if you're interested in being part of a continual conversation, being part of a community where people are discussing this, FlameNet membership is easy. You just send Sandhya an email and say, I would like to be part of FlameNet, and you'll be part of the community. And Lou just posted our website there. And so we are just a community of people who want to continue grappling with these topics. And as we've thought about, we really started thinking about how do we support students through failure? How do we support them in building resilience? But really, how do we create culture change around this in academia in order to create spaces where this is naturally part of the curriculum and is supported? And we've thought about that from, there's so many different angles of things that we do for students in the classrooms. Like Lisa said, things that are curricular, it comes down to how we as instructors are teaching and mentoring. And the thing that we've most recently put focus on is it really comes down to institutional leadership and institutional practices as well. Because if institutions are not valuing and supporting faculty in supporting students in failure, then that makes a big difference. Whereas if institutions, actually value the work being done by faculty to promote failure and to mentor students and to support them and help them feel included in whatever discipline they're in, and engage with them in research and be doing that really mindful mentoring through undergraduate research, also graduate research. Those are the sorts of things that are going to help students to grow and be resilient and, stay as part of whatever disciplinary field they're in. But those things really need to be prioritized, and they need to be valued, and they need to be rewarded by our institutions. And then that takes really wholesale culture change in academia.
We are nearing our the end of our time together. Once again, you can go to cur.org/bookshop or bookstore, cur.org, and you can download a free copy of Confronting Failure there. And then we also have our upcoming, thank you for putting that into the chat. We also have our upcoming CUR Conversations. Let me pull that up one more time. Preparing for Failure on September 29th, Responding to Failure on October 6th, and Mentoring Through Failure is on November 1st. If you continue to have any questions, feel free to reach out to us and we will get those to the appropriate contributors and editors. Otherwise, I thank the audience for being here and participating with your thoughts and questions. The chat was full of amazing compliments and great questions. And of course, I want to thank Lisa, Lou, and Jen for the hard work you've done in putting together this book. And we really feel it's going to be of great benefit to all of our CUR members, but anyone really in the undergraduate research field. So thank you very much. And we will see everybody hopefully at a later CUR conversation. Thanks.
We wanted to also just say thank you to all the authors, especially those that are here. Obviously, we really appreciate your contributions and your work with us.